The Aldrich mansion sat on a hill in Brookline, Massachusetts, old stone, iron gates, security cameras hidden behind ivy, the kind of home that looked beautiful from the outside and kept its damage behind closed doors. Finnegan Aldrich ran this house the way he ran his empire, quietly, completely, and without ever explaining himself to anyone. At 36, he was the most feared name in Boston's underworld. A man who'd buried his wife 4 years ago and hadn't let anyone close since except his daughter. Emmy was 6. She'd lost her mother at 2, too young to remember a face, but old enough to feel the absence every single day. She didn't talk much, didn't trust easily, and had already sent 3 nannies running before Marin Shaw walked through the front door. Marin wasn't supposed to stay. She'd grown up in foster care in Maine, bouncing between strangers' houses since she was 7, and she'd learned the hard way that love was just another word for something temporary. She took the nanny job because she needed a roof and a paycheck, not a family. But Emmy changed that. Somewhere between the bedtime stories and the stitched-up teddy bear and the quiet mornings in the kitchen before anyone else woke up, the little girl started calling her Mom, softly, secretly, only when no one was listening and Marin made the mistake every nanny's warned against. She loved that child back. Then, a letter arrived from Portland. Her dead mother had left her something, documents, money, answers she'd waited 20 years for, but the clock was ticking and she had to go. So Marin made a plan to leave without saying goodbye, because she knew if she looked into Emmy's eyes, she'd never walk out that door. She didn't know that Emmy had already heard everything. She didn't know that a 6-year-old's small hands had already opened her drawer in the dark, taken every piece of identification she owned, and hidden them where no one would find them, not out of cruelty, but out of the desperate, terrified love of a child who couldn't survive losing another mother. And she certainly didn't know that Finn had watched it all on the security cameras, knew exactly what his daughter had done, and said nothing because the most powerful man in Boston wanted the same thing his little girl wanted. He just wasn't ready to say it out loud. This is the story of a woman who couldn't leave, a man who couldn't ask her to stay, and a little girl who decided to take matters into her own hands. If this story hits you right in the heart, smash that like button so others can feel it too. Share it with someone who needs a good story tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come join us. You don't want to miss what's next. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To understand who Marin Shaw was on the day she walked through the doors of the Aldrich mansion, you have to go back 20 years to a small town in northern Maine, where a 7-year-old girl was sitting on the steps of a hospital, waiting for someone who would never come out again. Catherine Shaw died on a November afternoon. No one prepared Marin. No one sat down at the little girl's eye level and told her that her mother wouldn't be coming home. She only understood it that night, when there was no one to tuck the blanket around her, no one to sing the old song beside her bed, and the house suddenly became so wide and empty that the sound of her own footsteps echoed as if she were the only person still alive inside it. Her father, Thomas Shaw, had once been a gentle, quiet man, a plumber in Portland. But after Catherine was gone, he collapsed in the way men often collapse when they don't know how to cry. He didn't scream. He didn't smash things. He just drank. The first bottle appeared 1 week after the funeral. By the 3rd month, the bottle was no longer hidden in the kitchen cabinet, but sat right on the dining table, beside the plate of cold rice Marin had cooked for herself. By the 6th month, the neighbors began calling child services. By the 9th month, a woman in a gray coat came to the house with a file folder and a black plastic bag, large enough to hold all the clothes of a 7-year-old child. Marin didn't cry when she got into the car. She hadn't cried since that first night without her mother, because at that age, she had already begun to understand something many adults spend an entire lifetime learning, that tears don't change anything, and people only pity you long enough to watch you cry. Then they turn away. The foster care system in Maine moved her through 6 families in 11 years. The first family in Bangor had a red-haired woman named Mrs. Calloway who taught her how to fold clothes and say thank you after every meal. Marin began to believe this would be home. 9 months later, Mrs. Calloway became pregnant with her own child, and Marin saw the familiar black plastic bag lying on her bed again. The second family was in Augusta. The third family was in Lewiston. By the fourth family, Marin no longer remembered the name of the street where she lived, because remembering meant nothing when you already knew you would leave. She learned a rule of survival that no one taught. But every foster child knew, don't love anyone first. Don't attach yourself to anything that doesn't fit inside your suitcase. And don't ever call anyone family unless they call you that first. At 18, the system released her the way it releases an expired ticket. No farewell party, no blessing, just a folder of records, a Medicaid card about to run out, and the address of a shelter in Portland in case she couldn't find a place to stay. She found one. A shared room with 3 other girls in Dorchester, Boston, where she moved after getting a waitressing job at a small diner in the South End. She enrolled in community college, studied at night, worked 2 daytime shifts, waiting tables in the morning, and cleaning hotel rooms in the afternoon. She lived on cold coffee and leftover sandwiches from the previous shift. She didn't complain. She didn't tell anyone. She simply worked, day after day, in the manner of someone who had grown used to having no one to lean on but herself. At 26, she was living in a studio apartment no bigger than a shoebox in Dorchester, with a ceiling that leaked whenever it rained, a heater that only worked on one side, and a single window overlooking the parking lot behind a laundromat. The agency called her on a Tuesday afternoon. The woman's voice on the other end sounded hurried, as if she were reading from a long list. Family in Brookline, wealthy, widower, 1 little girl, 6 years old. They need someone live-in, full-time, good salary, private room. Maren didn't ask who the family was. She didn't ask how the wife had died, or why there had already been 3 nannies before her and none of them had stayed. She asked only one question. When do I start? Because Maren Shaw had lived nearly 20 years without a real roof over her head. And any roof, no matter who it belonged to, was better than nothing. Maren arrived at the Aldrich mansion on a Monday morning in early September with a single suitcase, the same suitcase she had carried through 6 foster care families, through the community college dormitory, through the leaking studio apartment in Dorchester. She was used to moving into other people's homes. She knew the rules. Keep your belongings neat, take up as little space as possible, and never let anything of yours spread beyond the room you were given. Her room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of the east hallway, 3 doors away from Emmy's room. It was larger than any place she had ever lived in, with a double bed, an oak wardrobe, a window overlooking the back garden, and a private bathroom with white towels folded neatly on the shelf. Maren set her suitcase down on the floor, looked around, and it took her a few seconds to realize that, for the first time in her life, she had a space that was truly hers and didn't have to be shared with anyone. Orla Quinn was the one who guided her through the first day. Orla was 40, with brown hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, a straight back, and footsteps that made no sound on the wooden floors. She was the head housekeeper of the mansion, and the way she spoke made Maren understand immediately that this wasn't an ordinary home. Emmy's breakfast is at 7 o'clock. You take her to school at 7:45. The car will be ready at the gate, but you don't drive it yourself. The driver will take you. Pickup is at 2:30. Light lunch at 3 o'clock. Afternoon activities are yours to arrange. Dinner is at 6 o'clock. And Emmy goes to bed at 8. Orla stopped at the staircase and turned to look at Maren with eyes that weren't cold, but weren't warm either. Mr. Aldrich works late. Sometimes very late. You don't need to wait up. Don't need to ask where he goes. Don't need to know who comes or who leaves. That part isn't your job, Maren nodded. She didn't ask anything else. Foster care had taught her long ago that in other people's houses, the questions that mustn't be asked were the most important ones, and the best way to keep a roof over your head was to pretend you didn't hear the things you shouldn't hear. But during the first week, she couldn't help noticing. Security cameras were everywhere. The first floor hallway, the front door, the back door, the garden, the entrance gate. Maren counted at least 9 just in the areas she passed through every day, and she was sure there were more in places she wasn't allowed to go. The iron gate out front was always closed, opened by a code, and 2 men in suits stood at the gate from morning until night. They didn't wear security uniforms. They wore suits. Maren noticed that detail. Then there was Walt Brennan. He was 58, with salt and pepper hair, tall, his back still straight despite his age, and he was present everywhere, at every hour, without anyone asking him to be. He wasn't the housekeeper, wasn't security, wasn't the driver, yet he seemed to do all of those things whenever necessary. Orla called him Mr. Brennan. Emmy called him Walt. No one explained who he was, and Maren didn't ask. She only realized that whenever Finn left the house, Walt stayed behind, and whenever Finn returned, Walt was the first person to meet him at the door, the two of them exchanging a few brief words Marin could never quite hear. On the third night, Marin woke at 2 o'clock in the morning to the sound of cars at the gate. She looked through her bedroom window and saw 2 black cars parked in front of the entrance. 3 men stepped out, dressed in suits, moving quickly into the house. The light in Finn's study on the first floor came on. 20 minutes later, those men left. The cars disappeared into the night. The study light went off. The next morning, no one mentioned it. Not Orla, not Walt, and certainly not Finn. Marin poured milk into Emmy's bowl of cereal and pretended she had slept very well the night before. That was how she survived. It had always been how she survived. Then Constance arrived. She appeared on the 5th day, walking into the mansion through the front door without knocking, wearing a cream wool coat, a single strand of pearls around her neck, and her silver hair cut short and neat. She was Finn's mother. Orla lowered her head slightly as she passed. Walt rose from his chair. The whole house changed when she stepped inside, not noisily, not through commands, but simply through the pure presence of a woman who was used to being obeyed without having to open her mouth. Constance looked Marin up and down with a gaze that lasted just long enough to measure her, but not long enough to be called rude. "So you're the new one." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. "Yes, ma'am, Marin Shaw. I know your name." She smiled, the kind of smile Marin had seen many times on foster mothers meeting her for the first time. The kind of smile that said, "I'll judge you, but I'll do it politely. Emmy needs stability. I hope you understand that. The 3 before you didn't. Constance didn't stay for lunch." She spent 20 minutes with Emmy in the living room, smoothing the little girl's hair, asking a few questions about school, then stood, put her gloves back on, and walked toward the door. As she passed the place where Marin stood, she stopped for half a second. "Your room is on the 2nd floor, isn't it? Near Emmy's room." Marin nodded. "Convenient, isn't it?" That was all. She stepped out to the car. Marin stood in the hallway, watching her go, and felt something so familiar it was almost comforting, the feeling of being judged by someone without having the right to answer back. She had lived with that feeling her whole life. At least here, she was being paid for it. Emmy didn't open her heart right away. She tested Marin the way children who have lost too much often test adults, not with questions, but with small traps laid quietly in silence to see who would give up first. In the 2nd week, Emmy threw all the toys from the shelf onto her bedroom floor, then sat on the bed and watched Marin, waiting. Marin didn't scold her. She sat down on the floor, picked up each toy, put it back in its proper place, and didn't say a word. Emmy watched her do it, her face expressionless, but her eyes were counting, recording, wondering whether this person was different from the 3 before her. In the 3rd week, Emmy said she wasn't hungry. Not for 1 meal, but for 4 meals in a row. Marin didn't force her. She simply left the plate of food on the table, said, "The food is here if you want it," then sat down in the opposite chair and ate her own portion. At the 5th meal, Emmy pulled the plate closer and ate without looking up. Marin didn't look up either. They both ate in silence, and that silence, for the first time, wasn't heavy. In the 4th week, Emmy stayed awake until 10 o'clock at night, even though bedtime was 8 o'clock. She didn't fuss, she didn't cry. She only lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and every time Marin came by the bedroom door, Emmy pretended to close her eyes. Marin knew she was awake. She pulled a chair into the hallway, sat just outside Emmy's door, opened a book, and read silently. She didn't go in. She didn't tell Emmy to go to sleep. She was simply there, close enough for the little girl to know someone was right outside, far enough that the little girl didn't feel forced. 20 minutes later, Emmy's breathing slowed and grew steady. She slept. Marin closed the book, stood, and went back to her own room. That was how she passed every test Emmy set for her. Not through perfection, but through the pure patience of someone who had once been a child, exactly like that. Marin woke at 5:45 every morning, before Orla, before even sunlight touched the kitchen windows. She made coffee, cut fruit, toasted bread, and arranged Emmy's bowl of cereal with banana slices shaped into a smiling face, not because the little girl asked for it, but because one morning Marin tried it and, for the first time, saw the corner of Emmy's mouth lift by half a centimeter. That half centimeter was worth more than any salary. By the second month, things began to change in a way no one in the house announced, but everyone either was deuced. One Saturday afternoon, Marin brought drawing paper and colored pencils out to the backyard. She sat on the stone step and began to draw, not inviting Emmy, not calling her over, only drawing. 10 minutes later, the little girl appeared at the back door, stood watching for a while, then sat beside Marin and picked up a blue pencil without saying anything. They drew side by side for a full hour. Emmy drew a house, a tall tree, and two people standing in front of the door. Marin looked at the picture, but didn't ask who the two people were. She knew that if she asked, the little girl would retreat into herself. So she only said, "You draw beautifully," then kept working on her own picture. They began going to Boston Common on Sunday afternoons. Marin pushed Emmy on the swing, bought her a warm pretzel from the cart at the corner of Charles Street, and the two of them sat on a bench beside the duck pond, reading side by side without talking. Emmy read a comic book. Marin read an old novel she had bought from a second-hand bookstore in Harvard Square. No one said anything, but Emmy's thigh touched Marin's thigh on the bench, and the little girl didn't move away. That was Emmy's language, not words, but distance. When she trusted someone, she moved closer. When she didn't trust them, she disappeared. In the third month, on a Monday morning in front of the school gate, Emmy stepped out of the car and unexpectedly turned back to take Marin's hand. It wasn't the quick grip of a frightened child, but the slow, deliberate grip of a child telling the world that this person belongs to me. The teacher standing at the classroom door saw it. The driver sitting in the car saw it. And that afternoon, as Orla poured tea for Constance in the living room, she told her everything, from the drawings in the backyard, to the afternoons at Boston Common, to the small hand holding tightly to Marin's in front of the school gate. Constance listened, without interrupting, without changing her expression. She only set her teacup down on its saucer more softly than usual and said, "Keep watching." But Orla wasn't the only one watching. That evening, Marin read a story to Emmy in her bedroom, her voice soft and even, telling of a little bear trying to find its way home. Emmy lay curled beneath the blanket, her eyes heavy, one hand still clutching her stuffed bear, the other lightly touching Marin's wrist as if she feared Marin might disappear if she let go. Marin didn't know that out in the hallway, 3 steps from the bedroom door, Finn Aldrich was standing still in the darkness. He had been standing there since she began reading. He heard every word. He saw his daughter's hand touching her wrist, and he stood there until Marin's voice faded, until Emmy fell asleep, until she quietly stood and walked toward the door. He stepped back into the darkness before she could see him. He returned to his study, sat down in his chair, and looked at the camera screen showing Emmy's bedroom, where his daughter was sleeping peacefully for the first time in a very long while. He didn't tell anyone about it, but from that night on, every evening, he stood in the hallway and listened. No one in the Aldrich mansion knew when that word began to become a habit. But by the 4th month, Mom was no longer a sudden, accidental call. It had become a ritual, small, secret, and sacred, in a way only 2 people understood. Every night before bed, after Marin finished reading the last page and set the book down on the nightstand, Emmy would pull the blanket up to her chin, look at Marin with eyes already heavy with sleep, and whisper goodnight. Mom so softly that if you were standing outside the bedroom door, you would think it was only a breath. In the car on the way home from school, while the driver focused on the road and the partition between the front and back seats was closed, Emmy would rest her head against Marin's shoulder and talk about school in her ordinary voice, but woven into those stories would be a sentence that began with, "Mom, today I..." And then she would continue as if that word were the most natural thing in the world. When drawing pictures at the kitchen table, when there were only the 2 of them and the sound of colored pencils brushing over paper, Emmy would push the drawing toward Marin and say, "Draw for Mom to see," then sit waiting, her chin resting on both hands, her eyes lighting up in a way Marin had never seen in her during those first weeks. Every time Marin heard that word, she felt 2 things at once, and both were so powerful she didn't know which one would swallow the other first. The first was warmth, the kind of warmth she hadn't known existed, as if someone had just turned on a light in a room where she had lived in darkness for 20 years. The second was fear, because Marin knew she wasn't Emmy's mother, she was the nanny. She was paid a salary. And one day, one way or another, She would leave, or be asked to leave, and the little girl would have to learn how to lose one more person. Marin had lived her whole life with that lesson, that every roof was temporary, every attachment had an ending, and the only person who would never leave her was herself. But every time Emmy called her Mom, that lesson blurred a little, and that was what frightened Marin most. Not the fear of losing Emmy, but the fear that she was beginning to believe in something she had no right to believe in. Constance noticed the change sooner than anyone. She noticed it not because anyone told her, but because Emmy no longer ran to the door when she arrived. Before Marin appeared, every time Constance came to the mansion, Emmy would stand at the staircase waiting, because, after all, her grandmother was the only woman left in the little girl's life. But now, when Constance stepped inside, Emmy was sitting at the kitchen table with Marin, and the little girl didn't stand up right away. She looked up, said, "Hello, Grandma," then turned back to the unfinished drawing in front of her. And that moment, even though it lasted only a few seconds, told Constance everything she needed to know. Her place in her granddaughter's heart was being replaced, not by a woman of the same class, the same family, the same blood, but by a 27-year-old girl from foster care, with no family, no roots, a nanny. Constance said nothing that afternoon. She drank tea, asked Emmy about school, praised the drawing, and went home. But in the car, she sat still the whole way from Brookline to Back Bay, and her hand gripped the purse on her lap so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Colette, her daughter-in-law, the woman she had accepted into the Aldrich family, had died 4 years earlier, and she had spent those 4 years making sure Colette's memory stayed alive in this house, through the photographs on the shelves, through the stories she told Emmy, through the fact that on every one of Colette's birthdays, she brought flowers and placed them on the table in the living room. She couldn't let a nanny erase all of that. Paxton Aldrich came to dinner on a Friday evening in late November. It was the first time Marin met Finn's younger brother. He was 33, 3 years younger than his brother. But he looked as though he were trying to seem older, with a 3-piece suit, an expensive watch, and a way of sitting at the dining table that took up more space than necessary. He had an easy smile, the kind of smile people gave to everyone but didn't truly mean for anyone. Dinner was quiet. Finn sat at the head of the table, speaking little as always. Constance sat opposite him, her back straight, controlling every conversation without needing to say much. Emmy sat beside Marin, and when Marin cut the meat for her, Emmy naturally leaned into her arm by instinct, the kind of lean children only make with the person who makes them feel safest. Paxton saw it. He set down his fork, tilted his head, and looked at Emmy with an expression he tried to shape into surprise, but which was really calculation. "Emmy looks completely different," he said, his voice light, ordinary, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I don't know if it's because she's growing up or because—" He didn't finish the sentence. He only looked toward Marin, then back at Finn, and gave a small smile. Finn didn't answer. He picked up his glass of water, took a drink, and changed the subject. But Marin saw his fingers tighten around the glass, and she realized that even though he said nothing, Paxton's remark had touched something he didn't want anyone to see. Dinner ended. Paxton drove away. Constance stayed another 20 minutes, then left as well. Marin cleared the table, put Emmy to bed, read her story, heard the whispered, "Good night, Mom," in the darkness, then stepped into the hallway and gently closed the little girl's bedroom door. She didn't know that later that night, in the first-floor study, Constance had called Finn before she even reached home. She said only one sentence: "You need to be careful with that nanny, Finnegan. Emmy is becoming far too attached to her." Finn listened, stayed silent for 3 seconds, then said, "I know," and hung up. But his "I know" didn't mean he was going to do anything. It only meant he had seen what his mother had seen it long before then, and he was still standing in the dark, watching, saying nothing, doing nothing, because Finnegan Aldrich was a man who knew how to control everything except one single thing, and that was the reason his daughter was happy. After that night's phone call, Constance didn't change her strategy. She refined it. She never said outright that she wanted Marin to leave, because women like Constance Aldrich didn't need to say things outright. She only needed to toss a small stone into the water, then walk away before the ripples reached the shore. Emmy's birthday was in December. Marin woke at 4 o'clock in the morning to bake. A 2-layer chocolate cake covered in buttercream, decorated with tiny fondant stars. She had spent 3 straight nights watching YouTube tutorials to learn how to make. The cake wasn't perfect. The buttercream leaned slightly on one side, and the fondant stars weren't even. But when Emmy ran into the kitchen that morning and saw the cake, she stood still for 3 seconds, then turned to Marin with eyes so wide Marin could see the kitchen lights reflected in them, and the little girl said, "You made this for me?" in a trembling voice, as if she didn't dare believe someone had woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning just for her. Constance arrived at 10 o'clock. She walked into the kitchen, looked at the cake on the table, and smiled. "Oh, you made it yourself." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation, the way she said everything. Sweet. Colette used to order from Flour on Washington Street. They make a wonderful chocolate ganache, 6 layers, hand-decorated. Emmy loved it. She paused, looking at the cake for one more second. But homemade has its own charm. Rustic. Then she walked away. Marin stood there, still holding the cake knife, and she said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. She understood exactly what had just happened. Constance hadn't criticized the cake. She had praised it, with the kind of praise in which every word reminded Marin that she wasn't Colette, that she didn't belong to this world, that her homemade cake was beautiful in a rustic way, meaning in the way of someone who couldn't afford to do better. If anyone asked, Constance could say she had been complimenting her. And that was her art, every sentence cut, but left no wound anyone else could point to. The stones kept falling in the weeks that followed. One afternoon, Constance brought 2 friends to visit the mansion. They sat in the living room, drinking tea, and when Marin passed by to take Emmy for her snack, Constance said without looking up, "This is Marin, our maid. She watches Emmy." Maid. Not nanny, not Emmy's caregiver. Maid. Marin heard every word clearly. She smiled, nodded in greeting to the 2 guests, and led Emmy into the kitchen. She didn't correct her. She didn't react. She didn't let her face change by even a millimeter, because Marin had lived 20 years in other people's houses, and she had learned that a reaction was exactly what people like Constance waited for, that if you didn't let them see the stone hit bottom, they wouldn't know whether they should throw the next one. Another time, Constance looked at the coat Marin had hung in the hallway, the cheapest coat Marin owned, worn at the cuffs and faded at the shoulders. She didn't say anything about the coat. She only looked at it, then looked at Marin, then said, "Boston winters are very cold. You should invest in a decent coat. If you need help, I can recommend a few places." Her voice was warm, concerned, completely beyond reproach. But Marin heard what she was really saying, that she didn't look good enough to stand in this house. With Orla, Constance didn't need to perform. One afternoon, while Marin took Emmy to the park, she sat with Orla in the living room, a teacup in her hand, her voice gentle as if they were making casual conversation. "I don't object to her, Orla. She works hard, I'll acknowledge that. But I'm worried Emmy is clinging to someone who doesn't belong here. Children need stability. Someone who'll stay for the long term, not a young girl who could leave at any moment when she finds a better job." Orla nodded, offering no comment. She didn't need to comment. Her role was to listen, remember, and make sure everything Constance wanted to know reached her at the right time. That was how this house operated, through information, through observation, through soft-spoken words that carried more weight than any command. Marin knew that. She could feel the pressure from Constance the way people feel a change in air pressure before a storm, unseen but unmistakably there. And she dealt with it in the only way she knew. She kept working, kept caring for Emmy, kept waking early, kept refusing to react, because that was how she had survived 6 foster care families, silent, patient, and unwilling to be defeated by people who believed she had no right to be here. That night, Marin couldn't sleep. She went down to the kitchen at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, heated water, intending to make a cup of tea and go back upstairs. But when she turned around, Finn was standing in the kitchen doorway. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled up, his hair slightly mussed, his eyes shadowed with the dark circles of a man who had stayed awake through too many nights. He didn't apologize for startling her. He didn't explain why he was still awake. He only stepped into the kitchen, took a cup from the cabinet, and set it on the table beside the kettle Marin had just boiled. She understood. She poured tea for him. Then, she poured tea for herself. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, silent, not looking at one another, only drinking tea beneath the single, dim yellow light above the sink. Maren didn't know what to say. She had never been alone with Finn for longer than a few seconds, and his presence carried a strange weight, not oppressive, but impossible to ignore. Impossible to pretend wasn't there. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Then Finn set his cup down and said, his voice low, not looking at her, "Emmy doesn't have nightmares anymore, since you came." Maren didn't answer right away. She looked into her cup of tea, where the surface was still faintly rippling, and she felt something tighten in her chest, not pain, but the feeling that came when someone had finally seen something she had been doing quietly for months without expecting anyone to recognize it. "I'm glad," she said. That was all. Finn stood, pushed his chair back to the table, and walked out of the kitchen. He said nothing more. He didn't turn back. But on the table, he left behind the cup he had emptied completely, and Maren sat there for a long while longer, looking at the empty cup across from her, wondering why such a short sentence from such a quiet man made her feel as though she had just been seen for the first time in a very long time. After the night they drank tea in the kitchen, Finn didn't seek Maren out again. He returned to the exact position he had held from the beginning, behind everything, in the darkness, in the place where he could see everything without anyone seeing him. But Walt Brennan had served the Aldrich family for 30 years, since Finn's father was still alive, and he knew how to read Finnegan Aldrich in a way no one else in the world could. Not by what he said, but by what he did when he thought no one was paying attention. Walt noticed the change on an ordinary afternoon. He was standing at the door of the study to report an issue related to a shipment at the South Boston port, and when he stepped inside, Finn was sitting in front of the security camera screen. Not the gate camera, not the hallway camera or the garage camera. It was the backyard camera, where Maren was sitting on the stone steps, teaching Emmy how to fold a paper airplane. Finn wasn't looking with the gaze of a man checking security. Walt knew what that look looked like after 30 years. The look now was different, slower, softer. And when Finn realized Walt was standing at the door, he switched the camera to the front gate so quickly that his hand almost jerked, the reflex of a man caught doing something he shouldn't be doing. Walt said nothing. He reported on the shipment, received his instructions, then stepped out. But from that day on, he began paying attention. And he saw more than Finn wanted him to see. Finn stood in the second-floor hallway every night, longer than necessary, listening to Maren read stories to Emmy. Before, he had stood there for 5 minutes, and then left. Now he stayed until Maren closed Emmy's bedroom door, and sometimes Walt saw him remain there for a few seconds more after she had already gone into her own room, as if he were waiting for something even he didn't know how to name. In the mornings, when Maren made coffee in the kitchen at 5:45, Finn began appearing earlier. Not in the kitchen. He didn't enter the kitchen, but Walt saw the light in the first-floor study turn on at 5:30, and from the study, one could see straight into the kitchen through the hallway. Walt didn't tell anyone this. Not Constance, not Orla, and certainly not Finn. He only watched, stayed silent, and waited, because he had learned long ago that in the Aldrich house, saying the right thing at the wrong time could be more dangerous than saying nothing at all. Paxton wasn't as subtle as Walt, but he was sharp in his own way. He was Finn's younger brother, 33 years old, and he had spent his entire life in second place. The family's deputy, the man standing right behind, close enough to know everything but far enough away to never be the one who decided. He was loyal to Finn, or at least he seemed that way, because Paxton understood that in their world, loyalty wasn't something you felt, but something you performed until there was a good enough reason to stop. He began noticing Finn's change around mid-December, after the dinner where he had commented on Emmy. He noticed not because Finn spoke more about Maren, but because Finn said nothing at all. During a family meeting at the South Boston warehouse, when one of their men mentioned that the mansion's security schedule needed to be changed because there's someone new in the house, Finn cut him off, in a voice sharper than necessary. "The schedule doesn't change. She stays." That was all. No explanation. But Paxton was sitting right there, and he heard what the others didn't hear, that Finn hadn't said, "The nanny stays," or "The employee stays." He had said, "She stays," and his voice when he spoke those 3 words carried a shade Paxton hadn't heard since the days when Colette was still alive. He didn't react. He smiled, nodded, said, "Of course, your call," then moved on to another subject. But in his mind, a small drawer had just opened, and he placed that piece of information inside it, carefully, neatly, waiting for the day he would need to use it, because Paxton Aldrich wasn't the kind of man who acted in haste. He was the kind of man who collected, patiently, and waited until the cards in his hand were strong enough to play a game he was certain he would win. Walt was the first person to speak with Marin, not because he wanted to, but because he felt he had to. It was late afternoon, and Marin was folding Emmy's laundry in the first-floor laundry room when Walt passed by and stopped in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing whether he should speak or not. Then he said, his voice low, not looking at her, his eyes turned toward the window at the end of the hallway. Marin. Yes, Mr. Brennan? Some houses look beautiful from the outside, but their foundations cracked a long time ago. You should be careful with the foundation. Marin stopped folding the clothes and looked at him. What do you mean? Walt didn't answer. He only looked at her for one more second, his aged eyes carrying something like the exhaustion of a man who had kept too many secrets for too long, then gave a slight nod and walked away. Marin stood there, holding Emmy's small nightgown in her hands, and for the first time since arriving at the Aldrich mansion, she felt not only the strangeness she had deliberately ignored for the past 4 months, she felt fear. But she didn't run, because upstairs, a few dozen steps away, there was a 6-year-old girl who would call her mom tonight before falling asleep, and Marin Shaw had spent her whole life running away from every place. She didn't want to run away from this one. The letter lay in the mansion's shared mailbox, mixed in among white envelopes bearing the logos of banks and insurance companies, and Marin almost overlooked it before she saw her name written in black ink on thick cream-colored paper, the kind of paper people only used when they wanted whatever was inside to be treated seriously. The upper left corner bore the name of the law office Holt and Associates, with an address on Congress Street in Portland, Maine. Marin took the envelope back to her room, closed the door, sat on the bed, and opened it with hands calmer than she truly felt. Inside was a 2-page letter, signed by Terrence Holt, attorney. The letter stated that before her death, her mother, Catherine Shaw, had deposited a small trust account and a sealed box of personal documents with the law office, with the sole condition that they be given only to her daughter, Marin Catherine Shaw, once she turned 27. Marin had turned 27 3 months earlier. The letter explained that the office had tried to contact her through her old address without success, and, after locating her current address through the public records system, they were sending this letter as their final attempt to reach her. Marin had 30 days from the date the letter was sent to appear in person at the Portland office, with original identification documents, including her driver's license, social security card, and birth certificate, to verify her identity and receive the property. If she didn't appear within the deadline, everything would be destroyed according to Maine state regulations. Marin read the letter twice, then 3 times. Then she folded it, placed it in the drawer beneath her clothes, and sat still on the bed for a very long time, looking out the window, where the afternoon light was fading across the slate roof. Her mother had left something for her. 20 years ago, when Marin had been too young to understand anything except that her mother wasn't coming home anymore, Catherine Shaw had sat down somewhere, in a law office in Portland, and signed papers, paid a storage fee, made sure that a part of her would wait there until her daughter was old enough to receive it. Marin didn't know what was inside the box. She didn't know how much money was in the trust account. But she knew this was the only thing her mother had left behind, and if she lost it because the deadline passed, she would also lose the last part of Catherine Shaw that still existed in this world. She had to go to Portland, and she knew that if she went, she wouldn't come back. Not because Portland was far, 2 hours by bus, she could go and return in 1 day, but because Marin knew herself. She knew that if she walked out of the Aldrich mansion, if she stepped onto a Greyhound bus and left Boston for even 1 day, she would see the world outside the stone walls in Brookline, and she would remember that she didn't belong here, that Emmy wasn't her child. That mom was only a word a 6-year-old girl whispered in the dark, and that word carried no legal value and no promise with it. And if she came back after seeing all of that, she would never be brave enough to leave again. She would remain forever in a house that wasn't hers, loving a child who wasn't her own. And one day, when Emmy grew up, or when Finn no longer needed a nanny, she would be asked to leave, and then the pain would be 10 times worse than it was now. So Marin decided, go, receive her mother's inheritance, and don't come back. She began preparing in silence. She wrote a resignation letter on a blank sheet of paper, folded it, and kept it in the drawer beside the letter. She hadn't turned it in yet. Every night after Emmy fell asleep, she folded a few items into the old suitcase. Not much, only enough so that on the morning she left, she wouldn't need to spend time packing. She used her phone to book a Greyhound ticket from South Station Bus Terminal to Portland, the 6 o'clock morning trip, arriving at 8 o'clock, just in time for the law office to open. She gathered all her identification documents into a brown envelope, her driver's license, social security card, a copy of her birth certificate, and tucked it into the bottom drawer beneath a layer of sweaters, where she thought no one would have any reason to look. One evening, after Emmy had fallen asleep and the house was quiet, Marin called Attorney Holt from her room. He answered after the third ring, his voice old and slow, the voice of a man who had practiced law long enough not to hurry anything. "Mr. Holt, this is Marin Shaw. I received your letter." "Miss Shaw, I've been waiting for this call. Can you tell me anything more about what my mother left behind?" Silence for 1 second. "I can't discuss details over the phone, Miss Shaw. That was your mother's request. But I can tell you that your mother was very careful with these documents. She wanted to make sure they reached the right person, at the right time. She paid the storage fee 20 years ago, all at once, in cash. And she told me that if the day ever came when her daughter called, I should tell her that everything her mother did was for her." Marin bit down hard on her lip. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried for her mother in a very long time. Not because she didn't remember, but because she was afraid that if she started, she wouldn't be able to stop. "I'll come, Mr. Holt, sometime next week. I'll be waiting for you." She hung up, set the phone on the nightstand, and lay down in the dark. From Emmy's room at the end of the hallway, she heard the little girl turn over in her sleep, the soft rustle of the blanket, then silence again. Marin closed her eyes and thought that this would be the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. Not leaving. She had left many places, but leaving without saying goodbye to the only person in this world who called her mother. Marin planned to leave on Friday. She had made the plan. Wake up at 4:30. Leave her resignation letter on the kitchen table where Orla would be the first to see it. Carry her suitcase down the stairs in the dark. Call a taxi to South Station and board the 6 o'clock Greyhound to Portland. She would be out of the mansion before Emmy woke up. She wouldn't look into the little girl's room. She wouldn't stop in the hallway. She would go, and she wouldn't come back, because if she stopped for even 1 second, all the courage she had gathered over the past 2 weeks would dissolve into thin air. On Wednesday morning, 2 days before she was supposed to leave, Marin woke at 5 o'clock as usual. She showered, got dressed, and before going downstairs to prepare Emmy's breakfast, she opened the bottom drawer to check the brown envelope one last time. Her hand moved the layer of sweaters aside, then moved it again. Then she pulled all the clothes out of the drawer and dumped them onto the floor. The envelope was no longer there. Marin knelt on the floor, both hands digging through the pile of clothes she had just emptied out, searching through every layer, every fold. Nothing. She pulled open the second drawer, then the third, and emptied them too. Nothing. She checked under the bed, face down against the cold wooden floor, her eyes sweeping along the darkness beneath it. Nothing but dust. She stood, opened the wardrobe, searched every shelf, every compartment, every coat pocket. She checked the bathroom floor, the bookshelf, the windowsill, under the desk. She flipped the pillows, pulled back the blanket, even lifted the mattress. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold. They were shaking from the feeling she had known too well for 20 years, the feeling of someone losing one more thing before she had even recovered from the last thing she had lost. The envelope contained all of her identification documents: her Massachusetts driver's license, her social security card, her copy of her Maine birth certificate. Those 3 things weren't just papers. They were the only proof that Marin Shaw existed in the system, that she had a name, a number, an identity, that she was a human being and not a shadow passing through other people's lives without leaving a trace. And now, all of it was gone. Marin tried to stay calm. She breathed, pushed her hair back, and went down to the first floor. Orla was in the kitchen, preparing the morning tea tray. "Orla, did anyone go into my room? Yesterday or last night?" Orla looked at her, her expression unchanged. No one is allowed inside staff rooms without reason, Marin. Why are you asking? I misplaced an envelope. It had personal documents inside. I haven't seen any envelope. Have you checked carefully? I have. Everywhere. Orla gave a slight shrug, the kind of polite shrug that didn't truly care. Perhaps you put it somewhere else. That happens all the time, Marin asked the driver, asked the cleaning woman who came every Tuesday and Friday. No one had seen it. No one knew anything. And Marin couldn't ask Finn. Because to ask Finn, did someone take my documents? She would have to explain why she had gathered all her identification papers into one envelope and hidden it in a drawer. And to explain that, she would have to say she was preparing to leave, that she had written a resignation letter, that she had bought a bus ticket to Portland, that she had planned to disappear from Emmy's life without a word. She couldn't say that to Finn. Not because she was afraid he would be angry, but because she was afraid of the look in his eyes when he found out, the look of a man who had trusted her with his only daughter, while she had meant to leave in the night like someone running away. Marin sat down on a chair in the first-floor hallway, her back against the wall, both hands resting on her knees, and tried to think. Without the documents, she couldn't go to Portland. If she couldn't go to Portland, she couldn't receive her mother's inheritance. The 30-day deadline was running, and nearly 2 weeks had already passed since the letter had been sent. She had about 16 days left. She took out her phone and found the number for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. Replacing her driver's license at the RMV would take 4 to 6 weeks. She called the Social Security Administration. Replacing her Social Security card required an original birth certificate first. She called the Maine Vital Records office. Getting a copy of her birth certificate would take 2 to 3 weeks by mail, faster if she went in person. But going in person meant traveling to Augusta, Maine, and she had no driver's license to drive, no identification to verify for a long-distance bus ticket, and she couldn't disappear for an entire day without someone in the mansion asking questions. Every call led to a dead end. Every dead end required more time than she had, and Attorney Holt's 30-day deadline didn't care about any of it. Marin put her phone away, closed her eyes, and felt the weight of everything pressing down at once. The plan she had built over 3 weeks, step by step, night by night, piece by piece folded into her suitcase. Every time she had told herself this was the right thing to do, all of it dissolved into thin air in a single morning, between an empty drawer and phone calls that led nowhere. She opened her eyes when she heard small footsteps on the stairs. Emmy was coming down for breakfast, her hair loose, her eyes still heavy with sleep, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm. The little girl saw Marin sitting in the hallway and tilted her head. "Why are you sitting here?" Marin stood, smoothed Emmy's hair, and smiled with the best smile she could pretend at that moment. "I was waiting for you to come down for breakfast. Come on." She took Emmy's hand and led her into the kitchen, and throughout breakfast, she poured milk, cut fruit, wiped the little girl's mouth, talked about school, about yesterday's drawing, about the duck at the Boston Common Pond, everything perfect, everything normal, everything hiding the fact that inside her, everything was falling apart. That afternoon, when the car brought Emmy home from school, Marin stood at the front door as she did every day, waiting for the little girl to run into her arms and tell her about class the way she always did, talking and breathing at the same time, one sentence piling over another, her hands waving, her eyes bright. But that day, Emmy stepped out of the car, looked at Marin for 1 second, then walked straight past her into the house without saying a word. Marin stood there, her arms still raised in the position of someone ready to embrace a child who never came, and she told herself the little girl was probably tired. Children had days like that. The next day, Marin placed the storybook on Emmy's bed at 8 o'clock at night as usual. Emmy lay on the bed, facing the wall. "What story do you want me to read tonight?" "I can read it myself. Are you sure? I can read the one about the little bear." I said, "I can read it myself. Not me," as a child speaking to someone close. That word cut into Marin more sharply than anything Constance had ever said, because it came from the one person against whom she had no shield. She placed the book on the nightstand, said, "Good night, Emmy," very softly, and walked out. The little girl didn't answer. There was no "good night, Mom." Only silence and the wall Emmy had turned her face toward. On the 3rd day, Marin reached out to brush Emmy's hair before school, the way she did every morning. Emmy jerked her head away from her hand. "Don't touch me." 3 words, a cold voice, eyes lowered. It wasn't the voice of anger. It was the voice of pain. The kind of pain children don't know how to name, so they have to dress it in the clothing of anger, because at least anger feels strong, while pain feels weak, and Emmy had lost enough to know that weakness protected no one. Marin drew her hand back, set the comb on the table, and said, "All right, you can brush it yourself." Her voice was calm. Her hand didn't shake. But when Emmy went downstairs, Marin stood in the bathroom, both hands gripping the sink, looking into the mirror, and it took her 10 seconds to arrange her face back into something that didn't look as if it were breaking. From then on, everything changed in a slow and merciless way. Emmy no longer sat beside Marin during meals. She carried her plate to the far end of the table, or worse, she carried it into the kitchen and sat beside Orla, something that had never happened before, because Emmy had never voluntarily stayed close to Orla. On Sunday, when Marin asked if Emmy wanted to go to Boston Common, the little girl said, "I want to go with Grandma." Marin nodded. "All right, I'll call Grandma." "You don't need to call. I can call her myself." Emmy picked up the house phone and dialed Constance's number. A number she clearly had memorized long ago but had never used, because before, she hadn't needed her grandmother when she had Marin. Now she was using her grandmother as a shield, and Marin knew it, and she knew something was seriously wrong, but she didn't know what it was. At the same time, the 30-day deadline kept running, and Marin tried to replace her documents, while also trying to understand why Emmy was pushing her away. On Monday, she used the hours while Emmy was at school to go to the RMV office in Haymarket. A long line, 2 hours of waiting, only to be told that replacing her driver's license would take 4 to 6 weeks, and that she needed at least 2 other forms of identification to verify her identity, none of which she had because they had all been in the envelope that had disappeared. On Tuesday, she called the Social Security Administration for the 2nd time. She waited 40 minutes on the line, only to hear that replacing her SSN card still required an original birth certificate or a passport, but she didn't have a passport, had never had one, and her original birth certificate had been in that envelope. On Wednesday, she called the main vital records office for the 3rd time. A copy of her birth certificate by mail would still take 2 to 3 weeks. She asked about expedited service. Yes, it existed, but it required going in person to Augusta and presenting a form of photo identification, which, again, she didn't have. The circle kept tightening. Every door she knocked on led to another door that required the key she had lost. Marin sat on her bed on Wednesday night and counted again. The time left before Attorney Holt's deadline, 11 days. The fastest time to get any document at all, 2 weeks. She was short 3 days. 3 days she had no way to create. In her desperation, Marin began to realize something she had been trying to push aside. The documents disappearing and Emmy's change in behavior had happened at the same time. Exactly the same time. Wednesday morning, the envelope was gone. Wednesday afternoon, Emmy didn't hug her when she came home from school, but Marin dismissed the thought the instant it formed, because it was absurd, because Emmy was only 6 years old, because a 6-year-old child didn't know what identification documents were, much less how to take them, and because if she began to suspect Emmy, then who could she still trust in this house? Constance came to visit on Friday. She saw Emmy sitting far from Marin at the dining table, and something flashed in her eyes, not worry, but carefully controlled satisfaction behind a calm expression. She sat down beside Emmy, stroked her granddaughter's hair, and spoke loudly enough for Marin to hear from the kitchen. "Children go through phases like this, Marin. It's not your fault. Sometimes strangers need to know when to step back and give family space." Strangers. Those 2 words again. Constance said them gently, with concern, completely beyond reproach, like every stone she had ever thrown. But this time, they landed in a place that was already cracked, and Marin felt their weight more clearly than ever. She stood in the kitchen, holding a dish towel, looking out the window where the Boston afternoon light was fading, and she thought that maybe Constance was right. Maybe she was only a stranger. Maybe she had been here too long, loved too much, clung to something that wasn't hers, and now even the child she loved most was pushing her away, and her documents had disappeared, and the deadline was running out, and she had no way out of this house, but she also wasn't sure anymore that she was welcome in it. That night, Marin sat on the bed in her room, with no book, no phone, no plan, only darkness, and the silence from Emmy's room at the end of the hallway, where once there would have been the whispered sound of "Good night, Mom." But now there was only the sound of a closing door, and the silence stretching until morning. Finn realized Marin was different on a Monday morning, when he passed by the kitchen at 7 o'clock and saw her standing in front of the gas stove, her eyes fixed on the wall above the window, while the kettle on the stove had already boiled over, water spilling across the stovetop and running down to the floor without her noticing at all. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. He looked at her for 3 more seconds, at the dark circles beneath her eyes that he could see clearly even from that distance, at the way her shoulders had sagged slightly as if she were carrying something heavier than she could bear. Then he stepped forward, turned off the gas stove, and walked out without saying anything. Marin startled when she heard the stove shut off, turned back, and saw his back disappearing at the end of the hallway. That wasn't the only time. On Tuesday, Marin forgot to pick Emmy up on time. The driver called after waiting at the school for 15 minutes, without seeing her come out to the car. Marin ran down the stairs, her face pale, her hand trembling lightly around her phone, apologizing 3 times in a row to the driver and to Orla. On Wednesday, she forgot a plate of food in the microwave until Emmy went to get it herself, and the little girl looked at her with eyes colder than usual before taking the plate to the living room and eating alone. On Thursday, Finn saw Marin standing at the second-floor hallway window at midday, looking out at the garden, motionless, while the washing machine had been beeping for a long time to signal that the laundry was done, and she hadn't heard it. He didn't say anything to her. He went to find Walt. Walt was in the first-floor security room, checking the guard schedule for the following week. Finn closed the door and asked, his voice low, not looking at Walt, his eyes on the camera monitors on the wall. "What's going on with her?" Walt didn't ask who her was. He didn't need to. "I don't know, sir. She hasn't told me." "Has she told anyone?" "Not from what I've observed. She keeps everything inside. She's always been that way." Silence. Finn stood by the security room window, his hands in his pockets, his back turned to Walt. "She looks like she hasn't been sleeping." "Perhaps you should ask her directly." Finn turned to look at Walt, not quickly but sharply. "I'm her employer, Walt. Not." He stopped in the middle of the sentence, not because he didn't know how to finish it, but because he knew too well and didn't want to say it aloud. Walt looked at him with calm, aged eyes, the kind of calm that belonged to a man who had served the Aldrich family long enough to no longer be afraid of speaking the truth. "Not what, sir?" Finn didn't answer. He looked at Walt for 2 more seconds, then turned away, walked out of the security room, and went straight to the first-floor study. He closed the door. Walt remained seated, watching Finn's back disappear behind the door, and sighed with the breath of a man who had seen this coming long before it happened. That evening, Marin fed Emmy dinner. The little girl ate quickly, didn't look at her, pushed back her chair, said, "I'm going upstairs," and climbed the stairs alone. Marin didn't follow. She cleared the table, washed the dishes, wiped the stove, all with the slow, mechanical movements of someone running on willpower instead of energy. She went to her room at 9 o'clock, closed the door, sat on the bed, and looked at the suitcase still lying in the corner, the place where she had begun packing, though now it no longer meant anything because she couldn't leave without her documents, and she couldn't stay when Emmy was treating her like a stranger. Her eyes were red. She wasn't crying, but they were red because she hadn't cried for many days, and sometimes not crying was more exhausting than crying. The knock came at nearly 10 o'clock, soft. 2 knocks. Marin opened the door. Finn stood on the threshold. He was wearing a black shirt, sleeves rolled up, the same as the night they had drunk tea in the kitchen. But this time his eyes looked directly at her, not away, not past her, but straight into her in a way he had never done before. He didn't step inside. He stood at the threshold, both hands at his sides, and the distance between the hallway and her room was only 1 step, but he didn't take it. "Emmy isn't talking to you anymore." It wasn't a question. He said it as if he were reading a report whose contents he already knew. "I know," Marin said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Do you know why?" "No." Silence. Finn looked at her, at the dark circles beneath her eyes, at the redness in them that she hadn't had time to hide, and she saw his jaw tighten and then release. the small movement of a man holding back something he wouldn't allow himself to say. "Are you planning to go somewhere, Marin?" The question hung between them at the threshold. Marin looked at him, and she didn't know how much he knew, didn't know whether Walt had said anything, didn't know whether he had watched the cameras and seen her making phone calls all week, seen her go to the RMV, seen her sitting on her bed counting the days in desperation. She didn't answer. Her silence lasted 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and it said more than any answer could have said. Finn nodded slowly, as if that silence was the answer he had been waiting for, but hadn't wanted to hear. Then he said, "Don't go." 2 words, low voice, not an order, though he was a man with the right to give orders. Not a request, though it sounded like one. It was more like a confession, the kind of confession Finnegan Aldrich wasn't used to making, and would probably never repeat. Then, he turned and walked away. His footsteps sounded along the wooden hallway, steady, neither fast nor slow, and Marin stood in the doorway of her room, watching his back disappear into the darkness at the end of the hall, and she stayed there long after he was gone, long after the sound of his footsteps had faded, long after the mansion had fallen into complete silence. She didn't know whether he had said, "Don't go," because of Emmy, because she was a good nanny and he didn't want to lose an employee, or because of something else. Both of them stood beside every day, but neither dared to reach out and touch. She closed her bedroom door. She lay down, and for the first time in many nights, she didn't think about the documents, didn't think about Portland, didn't think about the deadline running out. She only thought about those 2 words, and his voice when he said them, and the way the 2 shortest words she had ever heard from the quietest man she had ever met could make everything 10 times more complicated than it had been before he knocked on her door. Finn had known from the very first day. The night the documents disappeared, he was sitting in his study at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, reviewing the file for a deal at the South Boston port, when the second-floor hallway camera caught movement. He looked up. Emmy, his daughter, 6 years old, wearing pink pajamas with stars on them, her hair loose, her bare feet on the wooden floor, was tiptoeing down the hallway toward Marin's room. The little girl stopped in front of the door, tilted her head to listen, then turned the doorknob so slowly that it took nearly 10 seconds to open. She disappeared inside the room. The hallway camera couldn't capture what happened inside, but Finn didn't need to see it. 3 minutes later, Emmy stepped out, both hands clutching a brown envelope against her chest, and walked back down the hallway toward her own room. Emmy's door closed. The hallway was empty again. Finn sat motionless in front of the screen. He replayed the footage, watched it a second time, a third time. He looked at his daughter's small hands holding the envelope tightly, looked at the way she moved down the hallway without making a sound, careful, determined, the same way he had seen adults in his world behave when they were doing something they knew was wrong, but believed they had no other choice. And he did nothing. He didn't get up, didn't go to the second floor, didn't knock on Emmy's door, didn't take the envelope back and put it where it belonged. He sat there, in the oak-paneled study, looking at the camera screen showing the empty hallway, and he let it be, because Finnegan Aldrich, the man who controlled everything, knew exactly what would happen if Marin's documents disappeared. She wouldn't be able to leave, and that was what he wanted. He told himself he was staying silent for Emmy, that the little girl had already lost her mother once and couldn't lose another one, that he was protecting his daughter. But he knew, in the deepest part of himself, the part he never let anyone see, that Emmy wasn't the only reason. Walt discovered it, on the 3rd day after the documents went missing. Not because Finn told him, but because Walt knew how to read the camera system, knew which footage had been watched over and over based on the access logs, and when he opened the second-floor hallway recording from that night and saw Emmy, he understood everything in less than 10 seconds. He said nothing for a week. He watched Marin slowly fall apart, watched Emmy grow distant, watched Finn stand at the threshold and say, "Don't go," then walk away as if those 2 words hadn't just changed everything. And on the 10th day, when he saw Marin sitting alone in the first-floor hallway at noon, with the empty eyes of someone who had reached her limit, he decided his silence had lasted long enough. He found Finn in the study, closed the door, didn't sit down. "You know the child took the documents." It wasn't a question. Finn didn't look up from the papers on his desk. "I know, and you did nothing. I'm handling it. You're not handling it. You're letting it happen. Those are 2 different things." Finn looked up, his eyes cold. Careful, Walt. Walt didn't step back. He had served the Aldrich family for 30 years. He had kept silent in front of Finn's father when silence was necessary, and he had spoken plainly when plain speech was required. This was one of those moments. You're letting a 6-year-old child carry the consequences of your decision. Emmy took the documents because she was afraid of losing Marin. But you're staying silent not because of the little girl. You're staying silent because you're afraid of losing her too, and you're using your daughter's action as an excuse so you don't have to admit it. Finn stood up. Slowly. His eyes darkened in a way everyone who knew him recognized as dangerous. But Walt wasn't one of those people. Walt was the man who had held him when he was still in a cradle. You're behaving like your father, Finnegan. That sentence struck home. It struck home because it was true, and they both knew it was true. Finn's father, the previous boss, had been a man who used silence as a weapon all his life, allowing wrong things to happen when they served his interests, and calling it protecting the family. Finn had sworn he wouldn't become his father, and now Walt was telling him that he had broken that promise. Finn didn't answer. He stood there, both hands braced on the desk, head lowered, and stayed silent for nearly half a minute before Walt turned and walked out, leaving him alone with the weight of the truth he had just placed on the table. That night, Marin sat in the kitchen at nearly 11 o'clock, trying to call Attorney Holt again even though she knew the office was already closed. 10 days remained before the deadline. She had no documents. She had no way forward. She set the phone down on the table and simply sat there, beneath the dim yellow light above the sink, the kind of light she had grown familiar with from the nights she drank tea with Finn. But tonight, she sat alone. Then she heard footsteps, soft, very soft, bare feet on the wooden floor. She looked up. Emmy stood in the kitchen doorway. Pink pajamas with stars on them, hair loose. Stuffed bear hugged tightly to her chest. The same stuffed bear Marin had sewn back together on her first day here. The little girl's chin was trembling. Her eyes were red. Emmy? Why aren't you asleep? The little girl didn't answer right away. She stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at Marin, and Marin saw on that 6-year-old face an expression no child should ever have to wear, the expression of someone carrying a secret heavier than she could bear, and unable to hold it any longer. Do you hate me? The question fell into the silent kitchen like a stone dropping to the bottom of a well. Marin slid off the chair, knelt on the kitchen floor at the little girl's eye level. No, never. Why would you ask that? Because I did something bad. Tears began to run down Emmy's cheeks, silent, with no sobbing, just water moving steadily over her skin. I took your papers. I hid them in the toy box under my bed. Marin stopped breathing. I heard you talking on the phone. I heard you say you were quitting, going to Portland, not coming back. Emmy hugged the stuffed bear tighter, as if the bear were the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. I know it was wrong. I know. But Miss Orla said people need papers to go anywhere, and I thought if you didn't have papers, you couldn't leave. And I didn't want you to go. Her voice broke. Everyone leaves. Mom left. And now you. She didn't finish the sentence. She cried, the silent kind of crying, shoulders shaking, breath breaking apart, the kind of crying of a child who had learned how to cry without sound because she didn't want anyone to hear. Marin pulled Emmy into her arms. The little girl let go of the stuffed bear, her small hands locking tightly around Marin's neck, her face buried against Marin's shoulder, and her entire body shook in Marin's embrace. Marin held her back, tighter, and she felt her own tears running into Emmy's hair, but she didn't wipe them away, because right now, she didn't need to pretend to be strong for anyone. Please don't leave, Mom, Emmy whispered into her shoulder, her voice so small it was almost impossible to hear, the voice of a child speaking the most important words of her life without knowing whether she had the right to say them. Marin closed her eyes, held her tighter, and whispered back, I'm here, baby. I'm here. They sat on the cold kitchen floor beneath the dim yellow light, and no one said anything more. There was only the sound of their breathing gradually growing steady again, the sound of Emmy's small hiccuping sobs fading and stopping, the sound of the stuffed bear lying on the tile floor, and the warm silence of two people holding each other as if the world outside this kitchen didn't exist. Marin didn't know that out in the hallway, 4 steps from the kitchen door, Finn Aldrich was standing in the darkness. He had been there since Emmy said, Do you hate me? He heard everything. The confession, the crying, the sound of his daughter calling Maren Mom. He stood there, his back against the hallway wall, his eyes closed, and in the darkness, on the face of the most feared man in Boston, something was breaking, not loudly, not dramatically, only quietly, deeply, and beyond repair. After Emmy fell asleep on the kitchen floor in Maren's arms, Maren carried the little girl up to her room, laid her down on the bed, pulled the blanket over her, and placed the stuffed bear beside her pillow. Emmy didn't wake. She slept the sleep of someone who had finally let go of a burden far too heavy for 6-year-old shoulders. Deep, heavy, and completely surrendered. Maren stood at Emmy's door for a little while longer, watching the child sleep, then returned to her own room. She didn't know that 10 minutes after she left, Finn stepped into Emmy's room, took the brown envelope from the toy box under the bed, and carried it down to the first-floor study. The next morning, at 7:15, while Maren was pouring milk into Emmy's bowl of cereal, Orla walked into the kitchen and said in her usual voice, "Mr. Aldrich wants to see you in the study." "Now." Maren set the milk carton down, looked at Emmy. The little girl sat at the table, eating slowly. Her eyes still slightly swollen from the night before, but no longer cold, no longer turning away. And when Maren looked at her, Emmy looked back softly, with the gaze of someone who had confessed a terrible wrong and was waiting to see whether she would be forgiven. Maren touched the top of Emmy's head lightly as she passed, and the little girl didn't jerk away. That was enough. She followed Orla down the first-floor hallway to the heavy oak door at the end, the door she had never once been invited to step through in these past 4 months. Finn's study was a room paneled in dark wood, the curtains half drawn, natural light slipping in only through a narrow gap between 2 heavy folds of fabric. Bookshelves lined the walls. A large walnut desk stood at the center. 2 security camera monitors sat in the left corner, ones Maren had never seen but now wasn't surprised to see, and a black leather chair that Finn wasn't sitting in. He stood at the window, his back turned to her, both hands in his pockets. On the desk, right in the center, lay the brown envelope, intact. Maren saw it and stopped walking. She recognized the envelope at once, recognized the crease in the right corner, recognized the small ink smear on the back that she had accidentally made when she wrote down Attorney Holt's phone number. Finn turned around. "Your documents. Everything is here." Maren looked at the envelope, then at him. She didn't step forward to take it. She stood there, 3 steps from the desk, and asked in a voice far calmer than what she truly felt. "You knew from the beginning." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Because Maren had lived in this house long enough to understand that nothing happened here without Finn knowing. Cameras were everywhere. He watched them every night. And if Emmy had tiptoed down the hallway at 1 o'clock in the morning, he had seen it. "Hallway camera," Finn said. No further explanation. No defense. Just the truth, confirmed in 2 words. "And you didn't say anything?" "No." Silence. Maren felt something rise in her chest, not gratitude that the documents had been returned, but anger, the slow, deep kind of anger that came when a person realized she had endured 10 days of despair, 10 sleepless days, 10 days of watching Emmy push her away without understanding why, while the man standing in front of her had known everything and chosen silence. 10 days, she said. "You knew for 10 days, and you let me." She stopped, breathed. "Why?" Finn looked at her, and for the first time, Maren saw something on his face she had never seen before. Not the coldness he wore like armor, not the control he maintained with everyone, but the silent, undefended admission of a man who knew he had been wrong and wasn't trying to pretend otherwise. "Because I wanted you to stay too." The sentence hung inside the dark wood-paneled room. Maren didn't answer right away. She looked at him, straight at him, and she saw that Finnegan Aldrich, the man who controlled everything, was standing before her without a shield. "Walt looked into it when he saw you were different," Finn continued, his voice even, as if he were reading a report, because that was the only way he knew how to say difficult things, turning them into facts instead of feelings. He knew about the letter from Portland, Attorney Terrence Holt, your mother's inheritance, the 30-day deadline. Maren tightened her hands. Walt knew. Finn knew. This whole house had known her story before she had the chance to tell anyone. "I didn't look at the contents of your documents," Finn said. "And I didn't let Walt look either. They're yours. I only knew that you needed to go to Portland, and that you needed the documents to go." He stepped toward the desk, set his hand on the envelope, and pushed it gently toward her. I'll take you to Portland. My car, my people. You go, receive what your mother left you, and you come back. Marin looked at the envelope. Then she looked at him. Come back where? Finn looked at her, and she saw his jaw tighten, then release, that small, familiar movement she had learned to recognize over the past months. Here. One word, but the way he said it, not as if he were talking about an address, a house, or a job. He said it as if he were talking about a place where he wanted her to belong, and the weight of that word filled the room. Marin stepped forward, took the envelope, held it with both hands, and felt the familiar weight of the papers inside. Her driver's license, social security card, birth certificate, her entire identity, back in her hands. I need time to think, she said. You have 10 days. That's the time left on Attorney Holt's deadline. I know my deadline, Mr. Aldrich. Finn looked at her. A beat passed. Finn, he said. Marin tilted her head slightly. What? My name, Finn. You don't need to call me Mr. Aldrich. It was the final boundary between employer and nanny, and he had just erased it himself. Not with some grand gesture, not with a confession of love, not with anything the outside world would recognize as important. Only with his name, given to a woman he wanted to call him something closer than the distance he had kept for the past 4 months. Marin held the envelope, looked at him for one more second, and said, I'll let you. I'll let Finn know my decision. Then she turned and walked out of the study, the envelope clutched tightly against her chest, and when the oak door closed behind her, she leaned against the hallway wall, closed her eyes, and let out the breath she had been holding through the entire conversation. Inside the study, Finn stood looking at the closed door, and he thought that he had just done something his father would never have done. He had just given someone the right to choose instead of taking that choice away from them. And he didn't know whether she would choose to stay or leave, and that not knowing, for a man who had spent his entire life controlling every outcome, was more frightening than any enemy he had ever faced. Constance knew about the Portland trip before Finn had the chance to tell her, because Orla called her the moment she heard Finn ask Walt to arrange a car and protection for a trip to Maine over the weekend. She came to the mansion that afternoon, unannounced, walked into Finn's study without knocking, closed the oak door behind her, and stood before her son's desk with the posture of a woman who had been ready for this battle before she ever crossed the threshold. You're taking the nanny to Portland with the family car and our men. Finn didn't look up. He was signing papers on the desk, his pen still moving steadily. Yes, do you hear what you just said, Finnegan? The family car, family protection, for a nanny. What do you think people will say? What do you think the men who work for you will think when they see you driving the maid to handle her personal affairs? I don't care what people think. I never have. Colette hasn't been gone that long, son. 4 years. 4 years. And you've... Finn set the pen down. He looked up, and when his eyes met his mother's, they carried something Constance rarely saw in her son. Not anger, but a boundary, clear, hard, and non-negotiable. Don't use Colette's name to win an argument. His voice wasn't loud. It was even softer than his usual voice. But every word carried the weight of a man who had buried his wife, who had lived with that loss every day, and who wouldn't allow anyone, not even his mother, to use that name as a weapon. Constance fell silent. Not because she was afraid. Constance Aldrich wasn't afraid of anyone, not even her son. She fell silent because she realized that, for the first time in 36 years, Finnegan was setting a boundary with her that she couldn't cross. She stood there for 3 more seconds, then said, "You're making a mistake," turned, and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She closed it softly, with the controlled softness of someone who wanted to make it clear that she was leaving because she chose to leave, not because she had been dismissed. But Finn knew the truth. And Constance knew it too. Paxton learned about Portland through a different path. He didn't need Orla. He had his own people. One of Finn's close guards, a man Paxton had quietly cultivated over the past 2 years through small favors and off-the-books payments, sent him a brief message. Portland trip, weekend, private car, protection following, nanny going with Finn. Paxton read the message in his penthouse apartment in the Seaport district, set the phone down and sat still for a while. Portland. Maine. What business did the nanny have in Maine? He didn't ask Finn. He never asked Finn anything he could find out for himself. He called his contact in the public records system and requested a simple search. Marin Shaw. Main background. Anything related to Portland. The results came back in less than 24 hours. Maren Catherine Shaw, born in Portland, Maine. Mother, Catherine Ann Shaw. Maiden name, Catherine Ann Delaney. Deceased. And when Paxton read the name Catherine Shaw, something shifted in his memory, faintly, like a distant bell, but enough for him to open his laptop and access the family's old archive left behind by his father, files Finn never touched because he didn't want to know the details of what their father had done, but Paxton had read all of them, page by page, from the day he was old enough to understand that information was the only form of power a man in second place could accumulate. Catherine Shaw. That name appeared in the file of one of the family's shell companies in Portland 20 years ago. Accountant. Discovered irregularities in the books. Handled. Not handled in the literal sense, but in the way the Aldrich family used the word. Her life was systematically destroyed. Job gone, reputation gone, everything gone, until she was no longer a threat. Catherine Shaw, mother of Maren Shaw, the nanny living under Finnegan Aldrich's roof and caring for his daughter. Paxton closed the laptop. He didn't smile, but something flashed in his eyes. Something Walt would have recognized immediately if he had seen it. The calculation of a man who had just found the card he had been waiting years to hold. He didn't tell Finn. Of course he didn't. This information only had value if it was used at the right time, and this wasn't the right time yet. He needed to know more. 1. He needed to know what was inside the box of documents Catherine Shaw had left for her daughter, because if there was anything in there connected to the Aldrich family, this was no longer just a personal matter. It was a bomb. Paxton made a phone call. The person on the other end didn't need to know names, only instructions. A girl named Maren Shaw will be coming to the law office Holton Associates on Congress Street in Portland in the next few days. She'll be receiving a box of documents. I need to know what she receives, and if possible, I need to make sure those documents don't leave Portland. Understood. And she won't be traveling alone. My brother will be with her. Don't get caught. Paxton hung up, set the phone down on the glass table, and looked out the penthouse window where the lights of Boston flickered below. He thought about Finn, about the nanny his brother was growing soft for, about the box in Portland that held a 20-year-old secret, and he wondered whether Finn knew that the woman he wanted to keep was the daughter of the woman their father had destroyed. He guessed he didn't. And Finn's not knowing, like silence, like the closed doors in the house on the hill in Brookline, would become the strongest weapon Paxton had ever held in his hand. They left Brookline at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning. Finn drove. Not a driver, not a guard behind the wheel. He drove himself. The black SUV had bulletproof glass, and Maren had never sat in it before, because in the past, she had always sat in the back seat with Emmy whenever the driver took them somewhere. The security car followed behind them, far enough back not to draw attention, but close enough to respond within seconds if necessary. Maren didn't ask why they needed a security car for a 2-hour trip to Portland. She had lived in the Aldrich mansion long enough to know that she shouldn't ask, and long enough to understand that the answer would probably frighten her more than not knowing. For the first half hour, neither of them said anything. Finn drove, eyes on the road, both hands on the steering wheel, his expression the same as always, controlled, closed, revealing nothing. Maren sat in the passenger seat, the brown envelope containing her documents resting on her lap, looking out the window as the outskirts of Boston slowly fell away and gave room to Interstate 95 stretching north. She thought this was the first time in her life she had sat in the front seat beside a man whose relationship to her she didn't entirely understand. He was no longer only her employer, not after he had told her to call him by his name. But he wasn't a friend either, not a lover, not any title she could attach to him and feel safe. He was simply Finn, and she was simply Maren, and they were driving to Portland in silence. Maren was the one who broke the silence first, not because she felt comfortable, but because silence inside the narrow space of a car carried a different weight than silence inside a large house. It was closer, more private, and harder to endure. My first foster care family was in Bangor, she said softly, her eyes still on the window. A woman named Mrs. Calloway, red hair. She taught me how to fold clothes. I thought that would be home. Finn said nothing. But he listened. She knew because his hands relaxed slightly on the steering wheel, the small kind of loosening people only do when they shift their focus from the road to the voice beside them. 9 months later, she got pregnant. I saw the black bag on my bed again. The second family was in Augusta. The third was in Lewiston. And, by the fourth family, I didn't even remember the name of the street anymore. She paused. You learn not to get attached. That's the survival rule. Don't love anyone first. Don't call anyone family. Don't think any roof is permanent. If you follow those 3 things properly, when they bring the black bag, it doesn't hurt. And did it work? Finn asked, his voice low, his eyes still on the road. 18 years, until I met Emmy. Silence. The car crossed the New Hampshire border, the sign reading "Live Free or Die" sliding past the window. Finn didn't comment on what she had said. He didn't say "I'm sorry" or "That's terrible" or any of the things people usually say when they hear a sad story, because he understood that Marin wasn't telling it to be pitied. She was telling it because she wanted him to know who she was, and he respected that by listening without turning her story into something lighter than it truly was. Then he said, his eyes still fixed straight ahead, "I loved Colette." Marin turned to look at him. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife in front of her. Not through Constance's mouth, not through the photographs on the shelves, but from himself. "I loved her, but I couldn't protect her. She died on Interstate 93 on a March evening 4 years ago, and I live with that every day, not because I caused it, but because in my world, if someone under my roof gets hurt, it's always my fault." He didn't give more details. He didn't speak of the suspicion that the accident might not have been an accident. He didn't speak of the nights he had sat in his study watching the highway camera footage the police had provided. He said only enough for Marin to understand that he, too, was someone who had lost, and that loss wasn't something he shared with anyone, until now. The car moved in silence for another 10 minutes. Then Marin said, her voice smaller, almost a whisper, "Emmy calls me Mom." Finn didn't react. He didn't turn his head, didn't startle, didn't tighten his hands on the steering wheel. "I know," he said. "Since when?" "For a long time. And you aren't angry?" Marin used "you" in a closer way for the first time. Not "sir," not "Mr." "Aldrich," and she didn't realize she had done it until the word had already left her mouth, but she didn't correct herself. "No," Finn said. A beat passed. I'm jealous." Marin turned to look at him. He was still looking at the road, but his jaw tightened, and his hand held the steering wheel a little more firmly than necessary, and she understood that sentence had cost him more effort than anything he had ever said to her. He was jealous, not because Marin had replaced Colette, but because Emmy gave Marin something she had never given him, softness, absolute trust, the word "Mom" in the darkness, and he was her father, but he didn't know how to become the person his daughter ran to when she was afraid. Marin said nothing. She only placed her hand on the console between the 2 seats, palm facing up, not gripping, not reaching, just resting there. Finn glanced down at her hand for half a second, then looked back at the road. He didn't touch it. But he didn't move farther away either. And for the rest of the drive to Portland, neither of them said anything more, but her hand stayed there, and the distance between them, though measured only by centimeters on the car's console, had changed in a way they both knew but neither of them named. They arrived in Portland at 8:15. Holt and Associates was on Congress Street, on the 3rd floor of an old brick building near the harbor. Finn parked the car, but he didn't go inside. "This is yours," he said. "I'll wait here." Marin nodded, took the envelope of documents, and stepped into the building. Terence Holt was a man in his 70s, with white hair, round-framed glasses, and hands marked with brown age spots but still steady when he shook hers. He verified Marin's documents, checked each original, then opened the safe and took out a medium-sized cardboard box sealed with brown tape. On the outside, written by hand, were the words, "For Marin, when it's time." Marin recognized her mother's handwriting. She hadn't seen those letters in 20 years, but she knew them at once. The slight right-leaning slant, the strokes a little heavier at the end of each word, and she had to stop for 3 seconds before her hands were steady enough to take the box. She didn't open it right away. Holt said she could open it there, or take it with her, whichever she chose. She chose to take it with her, but before she stood, Holt took another smaller envelope from the safe. Inside was a black USB drive, and he placed it in front of her with both hands, carefully, as if what it contained were fragile. "Your mother sent this separately. She instructed me that you should view its contents somewhere safe. With someone you trust. She emphasized that very strongly. Maren picked up the USB drive, light, small, no longer than a finger joint, and wondered what could be inside such a tiny object that her mother had needed 20 years to make sure it reached the right hands. She thanked Holt, held the box and the USB envelope, and walked out of the office. Portland morning sunlight touched her face as she stepped through the building door, and she saw Finn standing beside the car across the street, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on her. She crossed the street. He opened the car door for her. "Do you have what you need?" "I don't know yet," she said, because that was the truth. She didn't yet know whether the box and the USB would give her answers or raise more questions she wasn't ready to face. They got into the car. Finn started the engine. The black SUV left Congress Street and headed toward Interstate 95. On the way back, Maren held the box on her lap and said nothing, and Finn didn't ask. 3 blocks behind them, a gray sedan that no one in Finn's car noticed had been parked along Congress Street since before they arrived. The person inside had photographed Maren walking out of the building with the box in her hands, photographed Finn opening the car door for her, photographed the license plate of the security vehicle following behind, and sent all of it to Paxton Aldrich before the black SUV had even managed to leave Portland. Paxton came to the mansion on Monday afternoon, while Finn was at a meeting at the South Boston warehouse and Emmy was at school. He knew his brother's schedule exactly. He always knew, because Paxton Aldrich never went anywhere unless he was certain of the absence of the person he wanted to avoid. Orla opened the door for him. He smiled at her, asked after her health, and stepped inside with the natural ease of someone who belonged in this house, even though the truth was that he had never truly belonged. He found Maren in the kitchen, washing dishes after lunch. She looked up when she heard footsteps, and Paxton's appearance surprised her slightly because he rarely came to the mansion when Finn wasn't home. "Maren, I need to speak with you." His voice was ordinary, friendly, the kind of friendliness he always wore like a suit, well-fitted, clean, and completely artificial. "About what, Mr. Aldrich?" "About your mother, Catherine Shaw." Maren set the bowl down in the sink, slowly. She turned to look at him, and on his face she saw something she had learned to recognize in foster care, the expression of someone about to give you information they knew would hurt you, but giving it because it served them, not you. "Do you know what your mother did before she died?" "She was an accountant." "Yes, she was an accountant, for a company in Portland called Northgate Holdings." "Do you know who owned Northgate Holdings?" Silence. Maren didn't know, but she began to feel as if the kitchen floor beneath her feet was no longer steady. "The Aldrich family." "My father, Finn's father." Paxton spoke each word slowly, clearly, as if laying bricks on a wall he knew would crush the person standing on the other side. "Your mother found irregularities in the books. She threatened to report them, and my father, in the way my father usually handled things, made sure she never had the chance to do that. Lost her job, lost her reputation, lost everything. And after that, she was gone." He stopped. "You have the USB drive Attorney Holt gave you. Open it. Everything is in there." Maren stood in the kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, and she felt something inside her falling, slowly, unstoppably, the same feeling she had known at 7 years old, standing on the hospital steps and understanding that her mother wouldn't come out again. Only this time, she wasn't losing her mother. She was losing the version of reality she had been living in for the past 2 years. He left. She stood there for 5 more minutes before her legs were willing to move. She went upstairs to her room, took out the box her mother had left behind, opened the envelope containing the USB drive, and plugged it into her laptop. The files appeared. Spreadsheets, company records, internal correspondence, photographs of handwritten documents. Maren read, slowly, line by line, and every line confirmed what Paxton had just told her. Northgate Holdings, the Aldrich family's shell company in Portland, where Catherine Shaw had worked as an accountant 20 years earlier. Accounting ledgers where her mother had marked irregular cash flow in red ink. A threatening letter from Northgate's lawyers demanding that Catherine sign a non-disclosure agreement. Termination records. A copy of the lawsuit Catherine had filed and then been forced to withdraw. Letters from doctors documenting severe depression. And at the very end, a handwritten letter from her mother, written to her, in the right-leaning script she had recognized at Holt's office. My daughter, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here to tell you myself. I'm sorry. Everything I did was to protect you. One day, you'll understand, and one day, you'll know what to do with this truth. Marin closed the laptop. She didn't cry. She sat on the bed, both hands on her lap, and stared straight at the wall in front of her with dry eyes, because what she felt now had gone beyond tears. It was larger, deeper, and it couldn't be washed away with water. The family of the man she was beginning to care for had destroyed her mother's life, and she was living in his house, caring for his daughter, being called mother by his daughter. Finn came back to the mansion at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He found Marin standing in his study, the laptop open on the desk, the USB plugged in, the files visible on the screen. He looked at the screen. He read. And for the first time in her life, Marin saw Finnegan Aldrich lose control, not through shouting or rage, but in the way he stepped back, only one small step, as if what he had just read had pushed him backward with a force he hadn't been prepared to resist. I didn't know, he said, his voice low and hoarse. Marin, I didn't know. You didn't know that your family destroyed my mother? Or you didn't know that I was her daughter? Both. Am I supposed to believe you? You don't have to believe me. You need to ask Walt. Walt was called in. He stood before them both, inside the oak-paneled room, the door closed, and he confessed everything. He had known Catherine Shaw. He had known the order Finn's father gave 20 years ago. He had watched Marin's life from a distance for years, not to harm her, but because of his conscience, because he had stayed silent when Catherine was destroyed, and he couldn't stay silent forever. When Marin applied to the agency for a nanny position, Walt was the one who made sure her file reached the list of candidates sent to the Aldrich family, not to hurt her, but because he believed this family owed her, and it was the only way he knew to pay that debt. I kept silent too long, Walt said, with the tired voice of a man who had carried this secret, heavier than any gun he had ever held. Your father didn't order Catherine Shaw killed, but he ordered her destroyed, and the result wasn't much different. You. Finn looked at Walt with eyes gone dark, and Marin saw in them not fury, but the shattering of a man who had just discovered that the foundation he had stood on his entire life had cracks deeper than he had imagined. Who else knows? Finn asked, his voice low, dangerous. Paxton, Walt said. He knows. He was the one who told Marin. Finn said nothing more in the study. He walked out, made a phone call, and 20 minutes later, he drove to the warehouse in South Boston, where Paxton had been summoned to wait. Emmy was nowhere near it. Emmy was at home with Marin, safe, knowing nothing, and that was the only thing Finn made sure of before he walked through the warehouse door and stood across from his younger brother. You used an innocent woman to strike at me, Finn said. You found our father's secret, kept it, and used it at the moment you thought it would do the most damage. Not because you care about Catherine Shaw, not because you care about the truth, but because you wanted to break something of mine. Paxton stood there, and for the first time, his familiar smile was no longer on his lips. You're blind because of her, Finn. She's the daughter of the woman our family. Catherine Shaw was father's sin, not Marin's. And if you think I'll let you use father's sin to destroy the only good thing in my house, then you don't understand me at all. Finn spoke the final sentence in a voice Paxton had heard enough times to know it wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. You're no longer Aldrich. Paxton said nothing. He looked at his brother and saw in Finn's eyes that this wasn't a game, that there would be no negotiation, no way back, and every card he had collected over the years had just burned to ash in a single sentence. He walked out of the warehouse and into the Boston night without looking back. Finn returned to the mansion near 10 o'clock. Constance was waiting in the living room. She knew. She always knew more than she showed. When Finn confronted her, she admitted it. She had known about Catherine Shaw from the beginning. She had known Marin was Catherine's daughter from the time Walt made sure her file reached the agency. She had tried to push Marin away with words, with small stones, with the words stranger and maid, because she was afraid the truth would come out and destroy everything the Aldrich family had built. I protected this family, Finnegan. That is the only thing I have done my entire life. You protected secrets, Finn said, his voice not loud, but every word carrying the weight of a man who had just lost his brother and was now looking at his mother with new eyes. That is not the same thing as protecting family. Constance didn't answer. She sat in the living room chair, her back still straight, the strand of pearls still lying neatly against her chest, but something had changed on her face. The kind of change one only sees when a person who has held control all her life suddenly realizes that control is gone. Maren sat in her room for a full hour after Constance left. She didn't open the laptop again. She didn't reread her mother's letter. She only sat on the bed, both hands resting on her lap, and stared at the wall in front of her with the eyes of someone trying to rearrange her entire life inside her own mind. 20 years. For 20 years, she had lived without knowing why she had truly lost her mother, why her father had fallen apart, why that 7-year-old girl had been pushed into the foster care system and drifted through 6 families without anyone keeping her. And now she knew. The Aldrich family. The house where she was living. The man she was beginning to care for. The cracked foundation Walt had warned her to be careful of. And now, she could see that crack more clearly than ever. The sound of small footsteps in the hallway pulled her out of her thoughts. Her bedroom door opened slightly. Emmy stood on the threshold, still wearing her school uniform, her backpack still on, and the little girl's eyes looked at Maren with a worry no 6-year-old child should ever have to carry. "Are you leaving?" 3 words, small voice, trembling. Like the night the little girl had stood in the kitchen doorway and confessed that she had taken the documents, only this time Emmy wasn't crying. She had used up all her tears. She only asked and waited, and in those 6-year-old eyes was the whole lifetime of fear of a child who had known loss before she knew how to read. Maren looked at Emmy. She looked at the little girl standing on the threshold, small and fragile, and she thought of her mother, of Catherine Shaw, the woman who had spent her final days making sure her daughter would know the truth. And she thought that her mother hadn't done all of that so Maren could use the truth as a reason to run away. Her mother had done it so she would have the right to choose, and Maren's choice, her real choice, wasn't revenge, or leaving, or anger. Her choice was standing on the threshold, hugging a backpack, waiting for her answer. "No," Maren said. "I'm not going anywhere." Emmy stood still for 1 second, 2 seconds, as if she didn't dare believe it, as if she needed more time to make sure the word she had just heard was real and not something she would wake up from and discover was only a dream. Then the little girl dropped her backpack onto the floor, ran across the room, and threw herself into Maren's arms with all her small weight. Her little arms locked tightly around Maren's neck, her face buried against Maren's shoulder. And she whispered, soft and secret, exactly the way she always said that word. "Mom!" Maren held her back, tight, and she said, in a voice she no longer needed to hide, "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." They sat like that for a long time. On the bed, in the room on the 2nd floor at the end of the east hallway, and Maren felt the little girl slowly grow heavier in her arms as sleep carried Emmy away, slowly, safely, with the sleep of a child who finally believed that the person she loved would still be there when she woke up. Maren laid Emmy down on the bed, pulled the blanket over her, placed the stuffed bear beside her pillow, and stood watching the little girl sleep for a while longer, before stepping into the hallway and closing the door softly. It was late at night. The mansion was silent. Maren went down to the kitchen, the way she did on every sleepless night, but tonight she didn't make tea. She only sat there, beneath the dim yellow light above the sink, the light that had witnessed the night they first drank tea, the night Emmy confessed, the night she sat alone counting the days, and she waited for what she knew would come. Finn walked into the kitchen at nearly midnight. He wasn't wearing a suit, wasn't wearing his usual black shirt. Just a t-shirt, pants, bare feet on the tile floor. He looked tired in a way Maren had never seen before. Not tired from lack of sleep, but tired from loss. Tired from a day in which he had stripped his brother of his place, confronted his mother, and seen the crack in the foundation he had stood on all his life. He sat down across from her. He didn't pour tea. He didn't turn on another light. He only sat there, in the dim yellow glow, and looked at her. "I'm going to open all of my father's files," he said. "Everything related to your mother. Everything related to Northgate Holdings. You'll have the truth, all of it, with nothing hidden." Maren looked at him. "And then what? Then you decide, stay or go. I won't hide your documents. I won't let my daughter hide them. I won't stay silent the way my father stayed silent." He said it in an even, slow voice, and Marin heard in it not the promise of a boss negotiating, but the promise of a man trying to become a better version of himself. That's a big promise, Finn. I know. Silence. Then Finn did something he had never done before. He reached across the table and touched her hand. He didn't hold it, only touched it. His fingertips on the back of her hand, light, slow, as if asking permission, as if touching something he wasn't sure he had the right to touch. Stay, he said. Not for Emmy, not for the job. For what? For me. 2 words. And the way he said them, not with the confidence of Finnegan Aldrich, the boss of Boston, but with the fear of Finn, the man sitting barefoot in the kitchen at midnight, afraid that the woman across from him would say no. Marin looked at him, looked into the eyes she had seen cold, had seen controlled, had seen broken, and was now seeing something very few people in the world ever got to see in Finn Aldrich. Truth, bare and unguarded, with no armor, no walls, no darkness to hide in. I'll stay, she said. Not because you asked, because I choose to. Finn looked at her, and for the first time, on his face, Marin saw something she could only call relief. The kind of relief that came when a person had finally set down something he had been carrying for far too long. He said nothing more. He only nodded, lightly, once. Marin stood, walked to the kitchen counter, heated water, and made 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for herself. She placed the cup in front of Finn, then sat across from him again, and they drank tea in silence, as they had on the first night. But unlike the first night, because on that first night, they had been an employer and a nanny sitting in a kitchen because neither of them could sleep. Tonight, they were Finn and Marin, 2 people who had walked through truth, through pain, through loss, and still chosen to sit here, facing each other, beneath the dim yellow light above the sink, drinking tea, saying nothing, because sometimes, after every word had been spoken, the silence between 2 people was enough. Outside, Boston slept. The city moved and breathed, and forgot everyone who wasn't loud enough to demand being remembered. But in this kitchen, no one needed to be loud. For the first time in 20 years, Marin Shaw didn't need to pack her belongings into a suitcase. She didn't need to remember the name of a new street. She didn't need to learn how not to love anyone. For the first time in her life, she didn't need to start over. She only needed to stay. And that is the story of Marin, Finn, and Emmy. A girl with no family who found home in the place she least expected, the most powerful man in Boston who learned how to let go of control in order to keep what mattered most, and a 6-year-old girl who used her tiny hands to hold on to the person she loved, because sometimes the greatest love doesn't come from strength, but from the smallest hands, doing the bravest thing in the most desperate moment. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button so more people have the chance to hear it. Share this video with the people you love, because a good story deserves to be told again. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, press subscribe right now so you don't miss new emotional stories every day. We'd love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever loved someone and feared losing them? Have you ever had to choose between the truth and safety? Have you ever stayed somewhere not because you had to, but because your heart chose it? Leave a comment below and share what you feel from deep in your heart, because every one of your stories deserves to be heard too, and we read every single comment. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last minute of this story. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.